September 2, 1945, Tokyo Bay, Japan. The morning air hangs cold and still over the gray waters of the harbor. Aboard the USS Missouri, its massive 16-inch gun turrets pointed skyward like iron fists, a document is signed, a war is ended, and the silence that follows is unlike any silence the world has ever produced. On the decks of that battleship, and on the decks of every ship in that enormous harbor, American sailors and soldiers exhale for the first time in 4 years. Some weep, some stare into the distance with eyes that have seen things no human being should be asked to carry. And below those decks, in the holds and storerooms and weapon racks of every ship in every harbor in every ocean where American forces have fought, a rifle waits. 9.5 pounds, 8 rounds, semi-automatic, a walnut stock worn smooth by the hands of 1,000 different men, an iron barrel that has fired across every continent. It has a sound, this rifle. A sound unlike any other weapon on earth. When its final round leaves the chamber, a steel clip springs free with a sharp, ringing, metallic ping, a sound that German soldiers in Normandy wrote home about. A sound that Japanese officers in the Pacific put into their military reports. A sound that meant, to every enemy who ever heard it, that an American soldier had just emptied 8 rounds into them faster than any bolt-action rifle in the world could have managed. Now the war is over, and there are 5,468,772 of these rifles, all of them sitting in silence, all of them waiting. What happened next, no one on earth had predicted. To understand the extraordinary journey that followed that silence, one must first understand what the M1 Garand represented, not merely as a weapon, but as an argument. An argument about what a free nation could manufacture, what a free man could carry, and what those two things together could accomplish in a world where ideology had become the ultimate battlefield. The story of this rifle begins not in an American factory but on a Canadian farm. January 1, 1888. Saint Remy, Quebec, Canada. John Cantius Garand entered the world as the 5th of 12 children, born into a French-Canadian farming family with little money and no particular connection to the world of weapons or warfare. He had no engineering degree. He attended no university. What he possessed was something that could not be taught in any classroom. A mechanical intelligence rooted in the physical world, in the weight and motion of things, in the difference between a mechanism that worked and one that merely appeared to work. When the Garand family moved south to Connecticut during John's childhood, he found work in the textile mills alongside his brothers, learning to read machines the way other men read books. By his mid-20s, that gift had produced a prototype light machine gun precise enough to attract the attention of the United States Navy. That attention carried him, on November 4, 1919, to the Springfield Armory in Springfield, Massachusetts, the oldest military arsenal in the United States, founded by George Washington himself in 1777. At Springfield, Garand was assigned a singular task: design a semi-automatic infantry rifle capable of replacing the bolt-action M1903 Springfield then in American service. He worked at the problem for 17 years. He rebuilt the operating mechanism from first principles multiple times. He pursued a primer-actuated design through years of development before abandoning it entirely and returning to a gas-operated system. When the Army changed its caliber requirements, as it did more than once, Garand changed his rifle without complaint. He worked in silence, with the same unhurried precision he brought to every mechanical challenge, until January 9, 1936, when the United States Army formally adopted his design as the U.S. rifle, caliber .30, M1. John Garand received a government salary of approximately $3,000 per year. He was never paid a single dollar in royalties for a design that would define the outcome of the largest war in human history. Congress considered compensating him. A bill proposing $100,000 was debated on the floor, and it did not pass. Garand accepted this with a quietude that said everything about the kind of man he was. He retired from the Springfield Armory in 1953, and he died in 1974, at 86 years old, in the same city where he had spent the whole productive life of his genius. The rifle he had built outlived him by decades. It is still being fired today. What the German Wehrmacht and the Imperial Japanese Army expected, in the opening years of the Second World War, was to face an American infantry arm not fundamentally different from their own. The bolt-action rifle had been the universal infantry weapon for 50 years. Every major military power on earth had fought the First World War with bolt-action rifles. Every military doctrine, every tactical manual, every infantry training program of the 1930s was built around the assumption that the bolt-action rifle was the baseline of infantry combat. That every soldier, regardless of nationality, worked the bolt between shots. That rate of fire was a function of individual training and discipline rather than mechanical design. What they actually encountered shattered that assumption completely. German soldiers who fought American infantry in North Africa in 1942 and 1943 began writing something disturbing into their letters home. The reports that filtered back to Wehrmacht headquarters from Tunisia and from the subsequent Italian campaign spoke of American squads that seemed impossibly numerous, of positions held by 12 men that produced the volume of fire expected from 30. German officers who had served on the Eastern Front, where Soviet infantry carried bolt-action Mosinagans much like the German Karabiner 98K, found themselves unprepared for the sustained, accurate, rapid fire that American rifle squads generated. A trained German soldier with his K98K could fire perhaps 15 aimed rounds per minute under ideal conditions. In the noise and confusion and physical extremity of actual combat, the realistic number was considerably lower. The American soldier facing him, with his M1 Garand, could fire 45 aimed rounds per minute. Not in ideal conditions. In the mud. In the dark. Under artillery. In conditions that made every physical action harder and more dangerous. 45 rounds per minute, without cycling a bolt, without breaking the cheek weld from the stock, without any manual action other than the pull of a trigger. The disparity was not merely tactical. It was existential. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, where infantry combat was fought at ranges measured in meters rather than hundreds of yards, where a single soldier moving between cover could be killed by the man who shot first, the M1 Garand's rate of fire was the difference between living and not living. German after-action reports from Normandy noted, with the careful professional language of military documentation, the extraordinary firepower of American infantry positions. Some German commanders initially reported facing automatic weapons when their scouts had encountered nothing more than a squad of riflemen with standard M1 Garands. And then there was the sound. When a German soldier was advancing through an American position and heard it, that sharp, ringing, metallic ping of a spent and block clip being ejected from an M1 Garand, he knew something precise and important. He knew that the American soldier who had just fired at him had fired 8 rounds. He knew the rifle was momentarily empty. He had, in theory, a brief window in the reload cycle to advance, to break cover, to close the distance. German training manuals from the later years of the war included notes on the M1 Garand's clip ejection sound as tactically relevant information, a moment of potential advantage for an enemy soldier skilled enough to exploit it. That a foreign army had to build American rifle reload sounds into its tactical doctrine is, in itself, an extraordinary testament to how profoundly the M1 Garand had changed the arithmetic of infantry combat. Japanese commanders in the Pacific wrote with similar alarm. In the island fighting from Guadalcanal through Peleliu to Iwo Jima, where combat was conducted at ranges so close that individual weapons often determined individual survival within seconds, the M1 Garand's rate of fire was a decisive advantage that Japanese infantry, armed predominantly with the bolt-action Arisaka Type 38 and Type 99, could not overcome through courage, training, or tactical ingenuity. Japanese military reports from the Pacific Theater noted the American semi-automatic rifle as one of the primary factors in the degradation of Japanese infantry effectiveness in defensive fighting. Officers who had studied in American military schools before the war and who understood, professionally, what they were facing, wrote analyses of the M1 Garand's impact that were candid about the weapon's psychological as well as tactical effect on Japanese soldiers. What both the German Wehrmacht and the Imperial Japanese Army had expected was an American army using the same weapons, in the same tactical framework, that they had prepared to fight. What they encountered instead was a demonstration of what a democratic industrial nation could accomplish when it committed its full manufacturing capacity to a single, clearly defined problem, the problem of giving every infantryman, every ordinary citizen soldier, the finest semi-automatic rifle that human engineering could produce. The scale of that manufacturing commitment was itself a kind of statement. Springfield Armory, the government arsenal in Massachusetts, was the primary manufacturer throughout the war, producing the majority of the 5,468,772 M1 Garands built between 1937 and 1957. Winchester Repeating Arms joined the production effort early in the war, and combined wartime production for Springfield and Winchester alone reached 4,040,802 rifles. But the M1 Garand's production story extends beyond government arsenals and traditional arms manufacturers. International Harvester, a company that in peacetime built tractors and agricultural machinery for American farms, produced M1 Garands. Harrington and Richardson Arms produced them. The same industrial infrastructure that grew American food and built American machines and powered American commerce was redirected, with remarkable speed and efficiency, to build the rifles that American soldiers carried to war. Every M1 Garand produced by International Harvester was a physical demonstration of the relationship between American economic abundance and American military power, the same factories, the same machine tools, the same skilled American workers, turned from the production of peace to the production of victory. Components from every manufacturer were fully interchangeable. A bolt made at Springfield functioned perfectly in a receiver made at Winchester. A barrel produced by one contractor fitted precisely to a stock produced by another. This interchangeability, the product of the American system of manufacturing, developed at the Springfield Armory itself in the 19th century, meant that the entire production run of 5,468,772 rifles functioned as a single coherent system. Any part from any rifle could maintain any other rifle. An armorer in the Pacific could rebuild a damaged Garand from parts drawn from a dozen different manufacturers and know, with certainty, that what he produced would function exactly as designed. General George S. Patton understood what this represented. On January 26, 1945, with the war still being fought on two fronts, with the outcome still, in some sense, being settled, Patton wrote to the Springfield Armory with a directness that cut through every bureaucratic formality. In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised. He was not speaking of the rifle in isolation. He was speaking of what it represented, the convergence of American industrial philosophy, American democratic purpose, and American military effectiveness in a single, 9.5-pound instrument of wood and steel. September 2, 1945. The document is signed. The war is over. And 5.5 million M1 Garands, each one a Patton-certified greatest battle implement ever devised, needed somewhere to go. The Army's immediate answer was the depot system. Rifles were collected from demobilizing units across every theater, cleaned by armorers who worked through mountains of weapons and improvised facilities, lightly coated in cosmoline, a rust-preventive grease the color of amber that would become inseparably associated with the M1 Garand in the minds of every collector and veteran who ever encountered it. Wrapped in wax paper, packed in long wooden crates, and shipped to government arsenals across the United States. The Anniston Army Depot in Alabama received hundreds of thousands of them. Other depots across the country received more. The rifles were cataloged by serial number, stored on metal shelving in climate-controlled warehouses, and maintained at a cost of approximately $2 per rifle per year. Across hundreds of thousands of rifles, across years that would become decades, those costs accumulated into sums that no civilian accountant would have found comfortable. But the Army preserved the rifles. Because the Army, perhaps more clearly than any civilian agency, understood that the peace of 1945 carried no guarantee of permanence. That understanding proved prophetic with uncomfortable speed. By 1947, the optimism of victory had darkened into the cold, sustained anxiety of a new kind of conflict. The Soviet Union had not retreated back within its pre-war borders after the defeat of Germany. It had pressed westward, installing communist governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and the eastern portion of Germany itself. Soviet pressure on Turkey threatened the strategic Bosphorus Straits. In Greece, communist insurgents supported from within the Soviet orbit were fighting a civil war against the Western-backed government. In Western Europe, communist parties in France and Italy commanded the genuine support of millions of voters and the realistic possibility of electoral victory. On March 12, 1947, President Harry Truman stood before a joint session of Congress and articulated what would become the defining doctrine of the next 4 decades of American foreign policy. The United States would support free peoples everywhere who were resisting subjugation from outside pressures. It would provide political support. It would provide economic support. It would provide military assistance. The Truman Doctrine was an ideological declaration, a statement of American purpose that transformed the defeat of fascism into a commitment to resist totalitarianism in every form, wherever it appeared, for as long as necessary. That doctrine required weapons. And the warehouses of Anniston and Springfield and a dozen other American depots held millions of them. The Mutual Defense Assistance Act, signed into law by Truman on October 6, 1949, created the formal mechanism. Under the military assistance program that followed, the United States would transfer to its allies the physical instruments of military power, and among the most numerous items transferred were the M1 Garand sitting in those vast American warehouses, sealed in their cosmoline, waiting precisely for this moment. Greece received M1 Garands to arm the forces fighting the communist insurgency in its mountain interior. Italy, the former enemy, now a founding member of NATO, received them to rebuild its shattered military. Turkey received them. Denmark received them. Belgium received them. The Philippines, fighting its own communist hook rebellion in the rural interior, received them. West Germany, transformed in less than a decade from the most dangerous enemy America had ever faced into the most critical frontline ally it possessed, received M1 Garands to equip the new Bundeswehr that stood between the Soviet tank armies and the Rhine River. The rifle that had defeated fascism was now deployed against communism. Its second life had begun, and it announced itself with the same sound it had carried through the war. That sharp, metallic ping, ringing now from Greek mountain passes and Italian parade grounds and Turkish border posts, carrying the same message it had always carried, that an American-designed, American-manufactured, American-distributed weapon stood between freedom and its enemies. The sound had not changed, only the enemy had. Then came Korea, and the M1 Garand's second life became its second war. June 25, 1950, 4 o'clock in the morning, the 38th parallel, Korea. 125,000 North Korean soldiers crossed the border in darkness and overwhelming strength, Soviet T-34 tanks leading columns that shattered South Korean border positions within hours. Seoul, the capital of the Republic of Korea, fell in 3 days. American forces, rushed from occupation duty in Japan, arrived in South Korea with rifles and courage and inadequate everything else, inadequate armor, inadequate artillery, inadequate training for the kind of mobile, high-tempo warfare the North Koreans were conducting with Soviet doctrine and Soviet equipment. What those American soldiers did carry, what they had always carried, was the M1 Garand. At the Pusan perimeter, in the desperate summer of 1950 when American and South Korean forces were compressed into the southeastern corner of the peninsula with their backs to the sea, the volume of small arms fire that American infantry could generate proved, once again, to be the decisive variable at the level of individual engagement. The M1 Garand's 45 per minute rate of fire, unchanged since Normandy, unchanged since Guadalcanal, was still superior, man for man, to the weapons that most North Korean infantry carried. At Pusan, it helped hold a line that had no right to hold. It helped by the 60 days that MacArthur needed to plan and execute the Incheon landing that transformed the entire strategic situation. Through 3 years of Korean War combat, through the catastrophic Chinese intervention of November 1950 that swept American forces back from the Yalu River in bitter cold, through the nightmare of the Chosin Reservoir where Marines and soldiers endured temperatures of 30 and 40 degrees below zero Fahrenheit while fighting their way out of Chinese encirclement, through 2 years of grinding positional warfare along ridges that had no names until American soldiers bled on them, the M1 Garand functioned. In cold that froze lubricant solid and cracked rifle stocks, it fired. In the monsoon mud of Korean summers, it fired. Soldiers who survived the Chosin Reservoir described arriving at collecting points with Garands that had been frozen solid, thawed by body heat, refrozen, and used as clubs in hand-to-hand fighting, and that still functioned as rifles when ammunition was placed in them. It was the kind of reliability that cannot be advertised or claimed. It can only be proven, in the worst conditions that warfare produces, by a weapon that refuses to fail the man who carries it. And through all of it, through every firefight, every ambush, every dawn assault and night defense, when the 8th round left the chamber, the N-block clip sprang free with that sharp, metallic ping. That sound, first heard by German soldiers in Normandy, now rang across the frozen ridges of a peninsula on the other side of the world. Chinese soldiers in the Korean War, trained by Soviet doctrine, equipped with a mixture of Soviet and captured Japanese weapons, learned the same lesson that German soldiers had learned in 1944. The sound meant an American soldier had just fired 8 rounds into them at a rate their own weapons could not match. And it meant, in the brief interval before the next clip was loaded, an opportunity so fleeting and so dangerous to exploit that many who tried were cut down before they could reach it. When the armistice was signed at Panmunjom on July 27, 1953, the Republic of Korea emerged from 3 years of existential war with a military built almost entirely on American equipment. The ROK Army held M1 Garands by the hundreds of thousands. Issued through military assistance program channels, maintained by Korean armorers and methods learned from American manuals, rebuilt and reissued across the long decades of the Cold War standoff that followed the armistice. Those rifles would sit in Korean armories for the next 50 years, their serial numbers registered in Korean military records, their histories now inseparable from the history of a nation's survival. In 1957, the United States Army adopted the M14 rifle as its new standard service weapon, the M1 Garand's direct evolutionary descendant, chambered for the new 7.62 by 51 mm NATO round, fitted with a 20-round detachable box magazine. The M1 was formally retired from frontline American service. Officially, it was surplus. Practically, hundreds of thousands of them remained in American government hands, in depots, in National Guard armories, in military assistance program warehouses. With no immediate destination and no clear future, the Army continued to transfer M1 Garands to allies who needed them. South Vietnam received them through military assistance channels, and South Vietnamese Army units carried M1 Garands into the early years of the Vietnam conflict. Army researchers noted, with careful professional language, that the M1's physical dimensions created genuine difficulties for Vietnamese soldiers of average stature. The rifle had been designed for an American infantryman, and its length and weight were significant disadvantages for smaller-framed soldiers operating in dense jungle terrain. But for village militia units defending hamlets against Viet Cong night attacks, the M1 Garand remained what it had always been, a weapon of extraordinary reliability and lethality that determined the outcome of ambushes in the darkness of the Mekong Delta. The sound of that en-bloc clip echoed now across the paddy fields of Southeast Asia, carrying the same meaning it had carried across the beaches of Normandy and the ridges of Korea. 8 rounds, 45 per minute. American manufacture, American precision, American industrial democracy, firing in the dark. But the most transformative chapter in the M1 Garand's post-war life was not written on any foreign battlefield. It was written in the quiet rooms of American government, in the form of a program that would have been considered extraordinary in any other nation, and that in America was simply a continuation of a tradition that stretched back to the founding of the Republic itself. The Director of Civilian Marksmanship, an office established in 1916 under the authority of the War Department, had been created to maintain a population of trained civilian riflemen capable of serving effectively as soldiers in time of national emergency. The philosophy was as old as the Republic. The armed citizen was not merely a legal right in the American tradition. The armed citizen was the foundation of national security, the ultimate guarantor of a freedom that no professional military alone could protect. The DCM had sold surplus bolt-action Springfields and other military weapons to members of approved rifle clubs and competitive shooting organizations for decades, always at below-market prices, always in the understanding that the purpose was civic preparation rather than commercial transaction. When the M1 Garand entered surplus status in the late 1950s, the DCM became its civilian custodian. The first sales of M1 Garands to civilian buyers occurred at Camp Perry, Ohio, in the late summer of 1955. National match-grade rifles, precision-tuned for competitive shooting, offered to qualified members of approved organizations. Regular service-grade sales began in 1956. By the late 1950s, an American citizen who was a member of an approved rifle club, who could demonstrate citizenship and a clean record, and who could complete the required government forms, could order a genuine United States military M1 Garand through the mail. The same rifle that had stormed Omaha Beach. The same rifle that had fought through the Chosin Reservoir. The same rifle that Patton had called the greatest battle implement ever devised. The price was $7.20. $7.20. The cost of a modest restaurant meal, less than the cost of a box of the ammunition it fired. The government had calculated the basic costs of inspection, minimal refurbishment, paperwork, and shipping, and set the price to recover those costs and nothing more. The underlying reality was that the government possessed so many of these rifles, hundreds of thousands of them, and valued so deeply the American marksmanship tradition, that the price it charged was almost symbolic. It was not a commercial transaction. It was a civic act. The weapons of national defense, returning from war, placed back in the hands of the citizens who had, in the deepest sense, always been their rightful owners. This was the transformation that no German military planner, no Japanese imperial strategist, no Soviet Cold War analyst had anticipated. Not one of them had modeled the possibility that a democratic nation, upon winning the greatest war in history, would take its most effective infantry weapon and offer it to its own citizens for $7.20. That possibility was not conceivable within any authoritarian framework. In the Soviet Union, in Nazi Germany, in Imperial Japan, the relationship between the state and the weapon was one of absolute state possession and absolute civilian exclusion. The weapon belonged to the state. The citizen carried it only when the state required it, in the direction the state pointed, for the purposes the state defined. When the state no longer needed the weapon, the state locked it away. America did something different. America gave it back. Veterans who had carried M1 Garands across Normandy and Guadalcanal, across the frozen ridges of Korea and the dust of the Italian campaign, could now own the same model, not a replica, not a commemorative, but the actual government-issued military rifle, arsenal inspected and approved, for less than $10. Men who had fought with this weapon, who had cleaned it every evening and slept beside it every night and trusted their lives to it in the worst circumstances human beings have ever constructed for one another, could keep it, could take it to the range, could hand it to a son or a grandson, could let the next generation feel the weight of what had been carried, hear the mechanical precision of what had been built, and understand, not abstractly, but physically, in the grip of the hands, what American freedom had required to defend. In 1996, Congress reorganized the Director of Civilian Marksmanship into a new entity, the Civilian Marksmanship Program, a federally chartered corporation independent of the Department of Defense, authorized to continue the transfer of government surplus M1 Garands to qualified American civilians. The CMP established sales stores in Ohio and Alabama, the latter near the Anniston Army Depot, source of much of its inventory. It created a grading system, field grade, service grade, correct grade, special grade, that allowed buyers to understand exactly what they were purchasing. It published detailed historical guides. It became the living custodian of the M1 Garand's American legacy, the bridge between the wartime production lines of 1943 and the modern shooting ranges of the 21st century. And then came the rifles from Korea. By the first decade of the 2000s, the Republic of South Korea held an estimated 857,470 M1 carbines and 87,310 M1 Garands in storage, American-made, American-designed weapons that Korean soldiers had carried through the Cold War and that now sat in Korean armories with no remaining military utility. A private American importer sought to bring them back to the United States, where collectors and veterans would have received them with enormous enthusiasm at projected prices as low as $220 per rifle. In 2010, the Obama administration blocked the importation, citing public safety concerns about reintroducing large quantities of military semi-automatic rifles into the civilian market. The controversy that followed was immediate and prolonged. Gun rights organizations pointed out that M1 Garands were already legally owned by hundreds of thousands of Americans and that the rifles were, by any reasonable definition, historical antiques. The last one had been manufactured in 1957, more than half a century before the importation dispute arose. Congressional hearings were held. Diplomatic communications between Washington and Seoul addressed the question of what to do with rifles the United States had given to South Korea 60 years earlier in the context of the Korean War. After sustained pressure, a partial reversal allowed approximately 86,000 M1 Garands to be re-imported, a fraction of the original stockpile. The remainder stayed in South Korean storage, their future unresolved, their serial numbers still registered in Korean military records, their history still unfinished. That a weapon manufactured in 1944 could generate a diplomatic dispute between two allied governments in 2010 is, in itself, a remarkable demonstration of the M1 Garand's extraordinary persistence. Other weapons from the Second World War had become museum pieces, collector's items handled with white gloves and climate-controlled display cases. The M1 Garand had never fully entered that category. It was still in storage, still in inventories, still generating bureaucratic and diplomatic attention, still capable of producing controversy, because it had never stopped being relevant. Because a rifle built to the manufacturing standards of the Springfield Armory in the early 1940s, maintained and rebuilt by Army armorers across decades of Cold War service, was still, in the 21st century, a fully functional, mechanically sound, historically significant weapon that millions of people wanted to own. The CMP continued its work. It continued inspecting, grading, and selling M1 Garands to qualified American civilians. Veterans, competitive shooters, collectors, students of history, people who simply wanted to hold in their hands the weapon that had, in some very specific and measurable sense, made the world they lived in possible. Prices rose steadily as inventory diminished and demand remained constant. A service-grade M1 Garand that the DCM had sold for $7.20 in 1958 was worth several $100s by the 1990s and approaching $1,000 or more for correct-grade matched examples in the 2010s. The market told a story that no government program could have planned, that the M1 Garand had not merely survived the war that gave it purpose. It had transcended that war. It had become something larger than a weapon. An artifact of a particular American moment, a physical object that carried within its tolerances and its serial numbers and its worn walnut stock the entire weight of what American democracy had built and sacrificed to defend. And still, across every decade, in every country where this rifle had ever been carried, there was the sound. In Greek mountain passes in 1948, it rang against limestone cliffs. In Korean valleys in 1951, it echoed from frozen hillsides. In Vietnamese Delta country in 1965, it faded into the noise of water and jungle. On American ranges in Ohio and Alabama and across 48 states, it still rings today, that sharp, metallic, democratic ping of a spent and block clip springing free from the action of an M1 Garand. It is the same sound that German soldiers wrote home about from Normandy. The same sound that Japanese officers put into their intelligence reports from the Pacific. The same sound that North Korean soldiers learned to listen for in the darkness of the Pusan perimeter. It has not changed. The clip ejects exactly as John Garand designed it to eject, in 1936, on a civil servant salary, in a government armory in Massachusetts. The sound that once defined the outer limit of what American industrial civilization could place in the hands of a free man is now simply the sound of a Saturday afternoon at a rifle range. Ordinary, familiar, and quietly extraordinary in the history it carries. German soldiers had expected that sound to fall silent when the war ended. They had expected the M1 Garand to join the other artifacts of the conflict in warehouses and museums and the slow forgetting that follows great violence. What they did not anticipate, what no authoritarian power ever anticipates, because it is genuinely incomprehensible from within an authoritarian framework, was that a democratic nation would refuse to lock its weapons away, would refuse to confine its instruments of national defense to state armories and government control, would choose, instead, to return them to the people. January 1, 1888. A farm in Quebec. A boy is born who will grow up to build a rifle that will help defeat fascism, contain communism, arm the free world, and eventually ring its metallic note of completion in the living rooms and gun safes of ordinary American citizens for the next 70 years. He will be paid a modest salary and no royalties. He will ask for nothing more. And the rifle he built will go everywhere, to the beaches of Normandy and the ridges of Korea and the jungles of Vietnam and the mountain passes of Greece and the armories of Turkey and the hands of Israeli soldiers and the ranges of Ohio and the diplomatic dispatches of Washington and Seoul, carrying with it, always and everywhere, the same message. That message was never about bullets or barrels or operating mechanisms. It was about what a free society chooses to build, and how it chooses to use what it builds, and what it does with those things when the war that required them has been won. Every other great power in the Second World War, victorious, defeated, or somewhere in between, eventually locked its weapons away, confined them to the state, removed them from the hands of citizens. America took a different path. America took 5.5 million of the greatest battle implements ever devised and distributed them, to allies who needed them to survive, to citizens who had earned the right to carry them, to the living tradition of the armed republic that had built them in the first place. That choice, that singular, democratic, characteristically American choice, is the real story of what happened to the M1 Garand after the war. Not the logistics of surplus disposal, not the diplomacy of military assistance programs, not the bureaucratic architecture of the civilian marksmanship program. The real story is simpler and deeper than any of those things. The real story is that when a free nation builds a weapon and wins a war with it, the weapon does not belong to the state that manufactured it or the army that carried it. It belongs to the idea that built both, the idea that free men, properly armed, are the most dangerous force on earth. Not dangerous to their neighbors, not dangerous to their government, dangerous to any power, anywhere in the world, that believes it can extinguish freedom and face no consequence. The M1 Garand was that idea made metal. And metal, as every soldier who ever carried one understood, does not rust when it is properly maintained. It endures. Decade after decade, government program after government program, war after Cold War after diplomatic controversy after Saturday afternoon at the rifle range. It endures. And somewhere, right now, in a gun safe in Ohio or a depot in Alabama or an armory in Seoul or a collector's display in a house in Virginia, an M1 Garand is waiting. 9.5 pounds of walnut and steel, 8 rounds loaded, ready to announce itself, when the moment comes, with that sharp, ringing, metallic ping that the whole world once learned to fear and that free men have never stopped recognizing as the sound of their own liberty, speaking in the only language that has ever truly been universal.